sort of light-hearted video, or not very heavy videos conceptually. I'm just going to quickly look at the definition of atheism in some of the dictionaries I have. Okay, so this is the Blackwood Dictionary of Philosophy, Western philosophy. So atheism falls under the topic of philosophy of religion, and first is giving the etymology of atheism. So a in Greek mean not, and theos mean gods. So atheism mean literally the absence of belief in God. Although my own sense is that even from the linguistic point of view, it's not just the absence of belief in God, but also it can be against the belief in God, for example. So that meaning can also be present, I think, even literally, even in the linguistic meaning. Okay, the belief that God doesn't exist, the belief that God doesn't exist. Well, also, instead of belief, we can use claim. So the claim that God doesn't exist. And the claim is not about, so it's not a conceptual claim. It's the claim about, they might involve conceptual claim, but ultimately says that the reference of the word God doesn't exist, or the concept God doesn't exist. So it's the denial of existence. And not then, but in between it's especially. It's not clear what that especially is emphasizing, but it might say that it's a claim that God doesn't exist in general, but especially personal God doesn't exist. So some of them might allow the best possibility that God exists, but doesn't have those qualities, or I don't know. But it does show that what the real hatred is, or real enmity is directed against. That is the personal, omniscient, omnipotent, benevolent God. That is the God of Christianity and Judaism and Islam, I guess. So it doesn't exist. So we just believing something which is a creation of our own figment of our own imagination for an atheist, I guess. So that's pretty clear throughout much of Western history. So this is a note on history, so we don't have to take it that seriously. Probably atheism has been a term of abuse, like a religious person can be a term of abuse today. And atheists have been attacked for impiety and immorality, and now religious people are attacked for hypocrisy. So I don't know how widespread it was, and whether the history of the long history. So he's talking about Middle Ages, Roman Empire, the Athenian and Greek Empire. What he's talking about. So we don't have to take these remarks too seriously. The non-believers of a particular religion have also been called atheists by believers of that religion. I'm not sure about this either. A lot of philosophers these days don't have religious background or theological training. They don't understand religions that much. But this might be true or untrue in certain cases. I don't know. It's not very important. At the philosophical position, okay, let's focus on this. As against, I don't know what, theological position. At the philosophical position, atheism is supported by several arguments. That's fine. There are a lot of arguments. Some good, some bad. So the arguments, the good arguments, bad arguments for and against God. Nobody can deny that. And probably there are more sophisticated argument for the existence of God, as we saw last time, because it has been so long, and a lot of the best mind in human history have been dedicated to God for a very long time in different ways. Even after scientific revolution and all that, and atheists have been minority throughout the history, and even today, I guess, because science. Okay, so atheism is. So the problem is not the argument. The problem is there any conclusive argument? That's the problem. People behave as if they have conclusive argument for or against the existence of God. My position is there are no conclusive argument for or against God. There are only probabilities, and those probabilities are partially determined by your own socialization and your own cultural and your own your own educational background and all that. Okay, so he says at a philosophical position, atheism is supported by several arguments. Yes. Now, I guess because that probably he is referring to the first argument. Science proves that matter is eternal. This is one of the most ridiculous things I've read in a while. Where does science proves that matter is eternal? I don't know. I don't even know whether science can actually define what eternal means very well. So this doesn't seem to be a very good argument. So since science proves that, because proofs mean that this argument is conclusive then. So science proved that matter is eternal. There is no need for God to be the creator of the material. Even this, if this argument is correct, and no need. So this is the argument from need. So in that sense, it's a conceptual argument, or even maybe then no need for God to be the creator of the material. But this argument, for example, wouldn't apply to Aristotle, for example. He thinks that matter is eternal. He still believes in God, and he establishes the existence of God through movement, and that's what most mutakallimin and theologians, Christian theologians, do as well, from hudusul alam to the creator, and that's the motion, not just eternity. Obviously, Muslim mutakallimin don't believe that matter is eternal, and Aquinas doesn't believe it, but philosophically he thinks that is philosophically legitimate to believe in eternity of God, and philosophically you can't disprove it, or you can have a good argument for eternity of the world, for example. But there are other Christian theologians who don't think so, etc. So what I'm saying is, firstly, this science doesn't prove that matter is eternal, and even if science proves that matter is eternal, this wouldn't be an argument against those who believe in God despite that, for example, and who rely on cosmological argument, for example, in a different way. For example, Aristotle, the need for God arises for the explanation of motion, and that's the pedigree of a lot of cosmological arguments. So that's not a very good start for atheists. But there's nothing against atheism. It's just a very weak defense. The existence of so many evils and defects in the world is incompatible with, and this is the second argument from the evil, incompatible with the existence of God, with the traditional supreme attributes. Incompatible in what sense? Logical sense, physical sense, how can existence be incompatible with concepts, unless you turn it into conceptual incompatibility and deduce existential incompatibility from conceptual incompatibility, etc. I think the argument from evil is a very strong argument, but what it does prove is probably improbability in that sense, but not incompatibility as such. And implausibility, maybe. It's a very strong psychological argument in a way. So both argument he has mentioned it, he hasn't done any justice, he or she, whoever has written this. God is claimed to exist necessarily. By whom? By mutakallimin and theologians, yes. By philosophers, yes. But it is difficult to make sense of the notion of necessary existence. No, I think notion is clear. It's just difficult to deduce actual existential necessity from conceptual necessity. Because what we call wajibul wujud, or necessary being, let me go to the board a bit. What is necessary existence? Or what our mutakallimin call wajibul wujud. If the main difference between wajibul wujud, necessary existence, and contingent existence is that we can imagine, like this is one of the ways you can think of the difference. We can imagine that, for example, my existence is contingent, because there's no contradiction in thinking that I might not have existed. But necessary existence is existence which, if you think that might not exist, would involve you in contradiction. And really the point is that the being of God is different in kind from the being of anything else. Because that's the being. Every being depends on others for its existence. But this is a being, it doesn't depend on anything else for its existence. It's self-sufficient in that sense. So there's no problem with I mean, obviously, there's some difficulty of imagination, which is always involved in philosophical entities, but that's not the main problem. The problem is we have the conception of necessary being. The problem is some philosophers and mutakallimin have claimed that this concept in itself implies existence. But as Kant and others showed that existence is not a predicate. And even if we claim that for necessary being it is a predicate, first we have to actually prove that necessary being exists. So the problem is not the conception. The problem is transition from the conception to actual existence. Yes, so let's go back. So these arguments contest important arguments for the existence of God. These three. The first one, an argument for atheism, and argument against the cosmological argument for the existence of God. The second one is argument against the benevolence of the God, and argument for atheism. And the third one is argument against the ontological argument, for example, for the existence of God. Okay, of significant philosophers, Holbach, Feuerbach, Marx, Nietzsche, and Sartre were all atheists. Holbach, I haven't read him much, but Feuerbach, Marx, Nietzsche, and Sartre. Marx is a sociologist. He started from metaphysics and all that, but he mainly relies on Hegelian metaphysics. None of these, probably with the exception of Feuerbach, is actually a metaphysician and logician and in all that sense. So yes, Holbach, Feuerbach, Marx, Nietzsche, and Sartre were all atheists. But there were many who were not atheists, like Kant, like Hegel, like Locke, for example, Berkeley, and hundreds of others. So atheism should be distinguished from pantheism, which claims to identify God with the world. Okay, I don't know if that's what pantheism is. It's very hard to understand pantheism actually, but there are different types of pantheisms. And from agnosticism, which claims that we don't know whether God exists, so they are supposed to be neutral philosophically. In other sense, atheism, in another sense, so a sense different from what we have been considering, atheism is the position of not being a theist. So it's not so much against theism, but just not being a theist. So God might exist, but doesn't govern or care for the world. So that's a sort of a deism, that God might have created God, and so God might have created the universe, but then he left it on its own devices. So he's not managing the world. This view, which is faithful to the Greek etymology of the term, is sometimes called negative atheism, in contrast to positive atheism discussed above. Negative atheism is just that you don't believe in existence of God as such. Negative atheism position that you don't believe, you are not a theist in the known sense, but you don't have any general belief about the existence of God, I guess. In contrast to the positive atheism, which actually says that God doesn't exist. So it's not just that they are not theists, but they are also against theism. Okay, this is just a quote. The controversy between atheists and non-atheists in Western society has usually been about the question of whether an all-good, all-knowing, all-powerful being exists. Okay, it's not a huge controversy in a sense, because none of the founding characteristics or beliefs of modernity actually hinge on the belief in atheism. So modern worldview is compatible with atheism as well as theism, but it's not compatible with the active civilizational role of the God of Christianity or Judaism or Islam. Okay, so we'll stop here then.